I remember one of the first things he did in his rallies was talk about economics and what real economics are. And they were almost tutorial rallies. And people heard, for the first time in a long time, common sense from somebody that was seeking political office.
You mentioned something there that I think is an irresistible irony around the whole thing, is that Milei's big buddy, Donald, if he was an Argentinian, would almost certainly be a Peronist, wouldn't he? In October, following a series of setbacks, Argentina's President Javier Milei unexpectedly came back to win the critical congressional midterm elections, stunning global investors and wrong-footing media commentators. This was quite something for a nation with a reputation for never missing an opportunity for missing an opportunity. Perhaps after decades of disappointment and dysfunction, Argentina really was now at a turning point that can bring lasting reform and economic recovery. These midterm elections were the first national referendum on President Milei's painful but necessary economic shock therapy. After nearly 2 years of deep spending cuts and wrenching fiscal adjustment, the vote was a critical test of the public's willingness to endure hardship for the promise of political stability and economic growth. The vote would either validate Milei's radical mandate or signal the beginning of the end for his ambitious project. The unexpected outcome represented a stark repudiation of the consensus view, following corruption allegations targeting the president's sister and chief of staff, and disastrous provincial elections just 6 weeks earlier. As recently as September the 7th, Milei's La Libertad Avanza LLA party was trounced in the provincial elections by the opposition Peronists, leading to widespread speculation that Milei's support was collapsing. However, on the national stage, LLA roared back with a victory that shattered expectations. The man with the chainsaw and a unique economic vision for his country had again overturned the odds. The LLA secured 41% of the vote, defeating its main opposition by a resounding 9-point margin. Theories for the dramatic turnaround range from a galvanized anti-Peronist voter base to an unproven but widely circulated claim in pro-Milei circles that a more secure national voting system eliminated about 1 million provincial Peronist votes that had been fraudulent. Others accused the US of buying Milei's victory with a strategically timed financial intervention in the days before the ballot. Regardless, financial markets, which had braced for the worst and sold off sharply after the September results, reacted explosively. There followed a peso melt-up as investors priced in the new reality. Milei's reform agenda had received widespread endorsement and a runway extension that could lead to an all-important second term. The currency leapt by more than 8% versus the dollar. Long-dated sovereign bonds rose 20%, bank stocks by 40%, with the shares of the country's largest listed bank gaining 130% from its mid-September low. Although the LLA remains a minority force in both houses of Congress, the election fundamentally altered the balance of power by more than doubling its representation. Milei's party critically strengthened his political authority. Holding more than 1/3 of the seats, the LLA can now prevent the opposition mustering a supermajority. The result provides crucial breathing room for Milei to protect his main achievement, Argentina's fiscal consolidation. As investors celebrated Milei's strengthened political position, the real test is whether the new arithmetic in Congress can translate market euphoria into tangible success. Yet despite reaching this significant political milestone, the path to lasting economic recovery remains far from certain. Argentinians have lived through a high-stakes experiment in fiscal discipline and deregulation. For investors looking on, there has been a remarkable macroeconomic stabilisation, with plummeting inflation and early signs of robust economic growth. However, for people in the street, it has come at a profound social cost, which they cannot endure indefinitely. The clock is ticking, but Milei just added valuable extra time. The administration's primary achievement has been its success in strangling the hyperinflation that, as recently as 2023, threatened to consume the nation. Milei inherited an economy on the brink of collapse, with an annualized inflation rate estimated at 15,000%, a fiscal deficit equivalent to 15% of GDP, and no borrowing capacity. As we know, his response was immediate and uncompromising. Upon taking office, Milei slashed spending, cutting the number of government ministries by more than half and laying off tens of thousands of public workers. Remarkably, by the end of Q1 2024, Argentina recorded its first fiscal surplus in a generation. The effect on prices was dramatic. Reported inflation month-on-month plummeted from 25% in December 2023 to just 2.7% by the time I visited Buenos Aires in November last year. I went there to see firsthand what was going on under the newly elected president. I met some fascinating people who told me their stories and gave me their perspectives on the Milei revolution. As I was researching for an article about my visit, I read some early accounts of the rise of Milei and the stories that were told about him back in 2022 and early 2023. In one article in the readers' comments sections, under a rather scathing report about Milei in the Buenos Aires Times, there was a short but forthright comment that explained why the reader thought Milei was likely to win the presidency. It was from a reader named Stout, who seemed to be a lone voice in the comments section, taking this rather counter view. I looked Jeffrey up and contacted him via LinkedIn, asking him a couple of questions. It turned out Jeffrey was in Buenos Aires and only a short walk from where I was staying, and the following day he met me for lunch in the Argentinian November-spring sunshine. Turned out Jeffrey, a successful businessman and US citizen, knew what he was talking about, and he kindly spent a couple of hours helping me understand a few fundamentals about how things worked, or most often didn't work, in his adopted country. 12 months on, with the midterms out of the way, I reconnected with Jeffrey for an update on what had happened over the year since we met and how he now sees things shaping up. He kindly agreed to record this interview, and this is what he told me. So please enjoy my conversation with Jeffrey Stout.
Brought to you by Progressive Equity.
So, Jeffrey, thanks so much for joining. Really nice to be back in touch. Can you just tell us a bit about your background, your connection to Argentina, and your perspective on the events there leading up to and following the election of Javier Milei?
I was a partner in the financial services practice of Accenture, the global management consulting, technology integration, and outsourcing firm. And for the last 18 years, I've had my own business doing a combination of software implementation work as well as executive recruiting. My wife is originally from Argentina, and once my children got of age where they were able to be on their own, we decided to start spending more time with my wife's family in South America, specifically in Buenos Aires. I ended up buying an apartment down here in 2019, and then through the pandemic, we ended up spending quite a bit of time in Uruguay, and we've subsequently bought a place in Uruguay. So we tend to spend the summers in Southern California, June through September, and then the spring down here in Buenos Aires, and then we're in Uruguay typically November till March, and then back to Buenos Aires, April and May, and then back to the US. So that's kind of our annual migration that we've done for the last 6 years or so. I obviously spent quite a bit of my professional career following, economic news and events from an American perspective, but coming to Argentina, it was a new place to learn. And from an economics or a person who's a student of economics. It's been a fascinating place to live. When I first started reading about and listening to Javier Milei, you need to understand it was in the context of a country whose economic policy over the last 70 years, its political and economic policy has resulted in 7 defaults and hyperinflation of nearly 200%. It's a country where nothing works. The banking system is highly constrained. Employment is very difficult. The business sector is very difficult. And a lot of that is because the former political regime viewed the government as the arbitrator of economic policy. They were involved in subsidizing certain things. They were involved in price setting. The Argentine government owns something like 50 to 60 distinct businesses, including YPF, a major oil company in Argentina, and most notably Aerolíneas Argentinas, so a major airline. And none of these businesses were run effectively. Argentina had significant losses in the hundreds of millions of dollars on Aerolíneas Argentinas alone every year under the former regime. And when Javier Milei came on the scene, I remember one of the first things he did in his rallies was talk about economics and what real economics are. And they were almost tutorial rallies. And people heard, for the first time in a long time, common sense from somebody that was seeking political office. And there's a lot of other bravado with the chainsaw and with the rock concerts and the hair and just his Make Argentina Great Again mantra and his alignment with Trump. There's a lot of other noise that surrounds Javier Milei and his devotion to his now deceased dogs.
Yeah.
But at the core of what he's talking about, it all makes sense to people. It's logical. It's based on real economic thought and practices and principles. And the other party was just continuing to talk gibberish and speaking to people as if they didn't understand anything about economics. And I think people were just tired of it. Things that are simple in the United States, transferring money, paying somebody through Zelle or any kind of payment mechanism. Some of those things here in Argentina are incredibly difficult to do. They say up to 50% of the economy here is informal or shadow economy, meaning people are employed kind of off the record, if you will. And then that compares to, about 7% in the United States and maybe 15 to 20% in Europe. So, it's substantial. And a lot of that comes down to just the sheer difficulty of dealing with the political apparatus and the government apparatus of Argentina. So I think people were open for change. And I think what I sensed from just speaking to people that I interacted with was a kind of a groundswelling support for something different.
How would you characterize the performance of the Milei revolution, if you like, in the 12 months since we last met?
I think they've made a lot of progress, most notably eliminating a lot of the government workforce. In Argentina, there's a history of the party that is in control using different agencies, basically creating employment in agencies, regardless of whether it's needed or not, to put people, more of their supporters, in jobs and use that as a mechanism by which to gain more political support. Milei went through, he first of all consolidated a lot of different agencies, eliminated many of them outright, and really shrunk the labor force of the government without creating any substantial increases in efficiency. He also has gone after the labor union movement in Argentina. The unions here, in my view, operate like a quasi-mafia organization. The government pays them money and then they distribute money to their union members. Because the money passes through the union first, the unions have a lot of control over what protests the union members show up to, and they always, call on strikes. And going back about a year, there were strikes almost all the time as Milei was taking away subsidies for different sectors of the economy and of the government. That's subsided, quite a bit. The other thing that has been notable is Aerolíneas Argentinas They can't return to profitability after some significant overhauls there as well. So I think the austerity measures have been effective. There were a lot of protests initially. I think those have subsided. I think what I feel just walking around, our neighborhood in Buenos Aires is, a little bit of swagger coming back. You see more businesses, cafes, restaurants that are opening. I'm seeing a continued progress. I think in some areas it's been slower than they hoped, notably around attracting foreign investment into Argentina. There's still been some companies that have decided to back out of Argentina. One, notably recently is HSBC, who sold their branches and their client base to Galicia, which is a local bank. But there continues to be a lot of potential. I think a lot of people were waiting for the results of the midterm. And then I think there's going to be another waiting period, which is going to be what are the additional reforms that Milei is able to activate. And when the legislature reconvenes on December 10th, how much progress is going to be made in privatization of these 50 to 60 different government companies. How much progress is Milei going to be making relative to growing the reserves? Up until now, he's used the reserves of the country to defend the value of the peso. A lot of people believe he should let the peso float freely and focus more on reserve accumulation than valuation protection. So, there's still some other shoes to drop, but with the midterm election that he just won, I think that's a big move in the right direction. And, his win was very decisive. It was more decisive than anyone expected, even him. And I think he's in a position now where, it's his to lose, and he's just got to run a professional operation from a political perspective and keep doing the things that he has committed to doing. And I think the people will reward him for it.
Just in the run-up to these crucial midterms, my takeaway from last year was that this year's midterms was going to be the next most important milestone for him ahead of the prospect of him perhaps getting re-elected. But the run-up to it was pretty volatile. What did you make of this sort of political scandal surrounding his sister, Karina, and the provincial elections in September, which seemed to fray the nerves of investors and the market and the peso ahead of these midterms? And then there was the timing of the swap line from the United States sort of emitting allegations that Trump basically bought him the election. Now, to your earlier point that I agree with wholeheartedly is the honesty of this man. He might be a bit loco, as they say, but he's an honest economist and he's prides himself in not being a corruptible politician.
There were 3 incidents that resulted in, the ugly head of corruption getting raised. There was a cryptocurrency that was promoted on an Instagram account that later crashed later in the day once the post got taken off. Allegedly, some crypto investors lost some money. To me, that read a lot like just sloppiness and got involved with some people that he probably shouldn't have. And I think just the immaturity of his political team.
From my perspective, that sounded like naivety rather than anything else.
The second thing was his sister allegedly getting bribes on some pharmaceutical contracts. The timing of those were right before the election. There hasn't been a whole lot that I've heard about that recently. It seemed like it was opportunistic to come out with that information. I'm sure that will unfold itself in, future court issues. But I don't know what to make of that either, to be honest.
One of my other contacts said, well, if that's all they've got on this administration relative to other Argentinian administrations, that's the least of our worries.
Yeah. And then there was a third incident where somebody showed up with undeclared suitcases on a private jet. And, there was never any reconciliation with customs of what was in those things. And you're talking about a country with a long history of people showing up, with suitcases full of cash and everything else. The optics of any of those things aren't great. Argentina is a very sensational news environment. And, it grabs onto stuff like that and talks way more about it than it probably is warranted. But I think the other thing they have going for them relative to corruption is the former president, Cristina Kirchner, is now serving house arrest for a significant corruption incident that she was involved in. They just started another trial against her where, another money laundering and corruption case. They just started that last week. She's currently serving, I think, 6 or 7 years of house arrest. But notably, the prosecution or the government is actively repossessing all of the real estate that she owns, all the bank accounts she owns, and all these other things. And also notably has eliminated her and her former husband's pension. And they're actually clawing back that pension as well because she's been convicted. So in the pale of that, these things seem like they're mosquitoes biting you on the arm, whereas the other thing is more like multiple gunshot wounds. I think people are taking it in stride, and obviously they did because he won by a pretty substantial margin in the midterms. And the second part of your question, we were talking about corruption, and we were talking about, did the U.S. government buy the election?
Yeah. How was that taken on the street? Do you think it was a factor in terms of the way people voted?
I personally don't know if the average person on the street in Argentina was really paying attention to that. To them, it sounded like another IMF loan. The IMF is a very talked about organization in Argentina because it's been so central to Argentina. I did spend some time speaking briefly to a director of one of the Argentinian banks about it. And he said, it's amazing that Argentina got the United States to do this. He said, I don't understand why the United States did it from their perspective. But he said, as an Argentinian, it's amazing that, the United States is showing that level of commitment to Argentina and the continued evolution of the economy.
Well, that was the other question I was going to ask you as an American, because it was certainly not taken well by the agricultural lobby in the US.
The American farmers are in a world of hurt right now. That isn't because of Argentina. It's because of trade policy with Asia. A lot of the buyers of American farming products, now have tariffs that are, 50 to 100%, which has crippled the farming community in the United States. The Argentina situation of buying Argentinian beef just adds insult to injury from my perspective. Whether you blew up the agricultural deal with Argentina or not, it's not going to really help the farmer situation. That being said, as an American, I see the alternative in Argentina. And the alternative is probably this guy named Axel Kicillof, who is the person that won the Buenos Aires province election in advance of the midterm. That is a Kirchner type person, Peronist. And his economic policy is basically to default on the IMF loan, ignore it, essentially. He's also one of the key people that's implicated in a case that's going through New York Supreme Court about Argentina taking possession of a company that was operating in Argentina.
The YPF Burford case.
Right. Which now is going to cost Argentina $10 billion or more. If Milei didn't win this midterm, that would have given Kicillof a lot of life. And I think the United States government, to their credit, realized, we're already into Argentina for $45 billion through the IMF, essentially. And we have the opportunity to do a swap line, which is different than giving money to somebody.
Yeah. I mean, Besant's been pretty vigorous in defending it and claiming even that it's been a profitable trade.
This was a trade for him that I think, if he felt the news of 20 billion could affect the election in a positive way, I think that they were willing to take the risk, given the circumstances. I think also I see the administration, and I don't know if this is Trump or Rubio or Besant, but kind of recalibrating the United States' policy towards South America. And you see it with, going after cartels. You see it going after Maduro in Venezuela. You see it propping up Javier Milei in Argentina, and basically using different things, whether it's militarily, politically, or economically, to enhance the things that they see happening in South America that they view to be positive. The reality is that, Argentina is sitting on some of the largest oil reserves in the world. They have some of the biggest lithium mines in the world. The United States is desperate for alternatives on rare earth minerals other than China. And having recently spent a week traveling 2,000 kilometers through Patagonia, I can't imagine there's not those kind of minerals in Argentina somewhere, given the sheer size of the country. And I just don't think anybody's ever looked. So I think that $20 billion swap line was, sure, it was for the election, but I think there's a larger strategy at play. And I'm not generally a Trump supporter. I have never voted for him, but I do think that what the administration is doing with South America and with Argentina in particular, I think is a little bit more strategic.
Thanks for listening to this episode of In the Company of Mavericks. The engagement and listener numbers have grown strongly in recent months, which is great. Increasingly, my guest recommendations and introductions have come from listeners, people like you. If you have anyone you know or follow that you think would make a good guest on In the Company of Mavericks, then I'd love to hear from you with the idea, or even better, with the introduction. Please contact me via LinkedIn, Substack, or at jeremymckeown@gmail.com. Even if it's just to say hi, give me some feedback about the podcast, or perhaps subjects you might like me to cover. I'd love to hear from you. I think it's a resurgence of the Monroe Doctrine that they see South America, Latin America, Central America as the backyard. You mentioned the currency issue and the lack so far of real critical success in foreign inward investment. I agree with you that I think a lot of big potential investors into Argentina would almost inevitably wait for the midterms. So that flag has dropped, if you like. But we've got a kind of fudged currency issue, I think, around the peso, which I don't know how he navigates, because before the 23 election, he was saying, just scrap the peso, we'll take the dollar, thank you very much. He's backed off that. Then it was sort of, well, he's a free market guy, just let it float. And he was talked out of that, or he's decided for whatever reason he can't afford to do that. And I've heard, I don't know whether it's true or not, but I've heard people who seem to make it their business to understand these things, that he's not even going to go there until his second term, which to me sounds risky because it just makes it too expensive. Even when I was there last year, the prices were okay, but they weren't rock bottom, certainly not in the nicer parts of Buenos Aires.
Yeah, I think the currency's trading around 1,400 to 1 right now, 1,400 pesos to the US dollar. I think most people think that if it were to float freely, it ought to be around 1,650 to 1,700, maybe 20% lower, which I think if Milei can get away with the currency staying in the trading band without intervention, meaning he doesn't have to use reserves to buy pesos, then I think it's okay. When the Congress reconvenes on December 12th, he's going to announce a whole list of new things. There's going to be a lot of things kind of hitting the news all at the same time.
It's the classic case for a political reset now, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a political reset, right. And I think that will be his opportunity to say, okay, this is what we did to get here. Now we're entering phase 2 or phase 3, and now we're going to do this. And I think there is a lot of attention on increasing the reserves. And I think to the extent you're using reserves to defend the value of the peso, I think you have to stop that. I think if you stop that, then you make everything more affordable, and you are also doing more to encourage international investment. International investors don't want to come start investing money in Argentina, and while they're starting that process, 6 months later, there's a 20% correction in the value of the currency that they're going to have to eat. So I think a freely floating currency, I think, is pretty critical to attracting external investment, and I think they know that.
That's also critical in terms of Argentina returning to the global capital markets.
Exactly. And think about this. If he had lost the election, they'd be out of money already. So the fact that he won gives people a little bit of confidence, which is why the currency is continuing to trade in the designated range without significant intervention. But they don't want to provide that guarantee forever, because if something strange happens, Argentinians are well known and well practiced in running for the dollar in the light of any kind of increase in risk profile, as they should.
You're an entrepreneur, you're a businessman, you've got assets in the US, presumably in South America, in Argentina. What would you look for in that shopping list if you were to consider, at the margin, increasing your investment, your asset position in Argentina versus the other options you've got? We've got the peso. What are the things to do with other reforms in the economy to attract your dollar in to invest in Argentina?
Well, I think you've listed some of them, but Milei's announced that he's going to make some recommendations regarding labor reform. Right now, it's very difficult to adjust your labor force if you're a company in Argentina. It's a very pro-labor marketplace. You know, I live in California, which is a very pro-labor state. Argentina is even further left than that by quite a bit. So the labor environment is so tenuous for employers that many employers understaff in different places. And you see this if you're in restaurants and other types of service-oriented businesses. The second thing is, tax reform. They're talking about getting down to a much more simple tax policy. They haven't given a lot of insight into what that is, but in Argentina today, there's income taxes which are paid primarily by the employer on behalf of the employees to the government. There's also VAT tax and a whole bunch of other taxes here and there. It's a Byzantine tax code, hundreds and hundreds of different taxes. I think they want to get it down to a few kind of key taxes and look for ways to simplify things pretty substantially. The other element is pension reform. This is something that, both governments and businesses bear the burden of. But if you look at the United States, 30, 40 years ago, you had companies that were providing pensions to people, once they retired for the rest of their lives. You have a similar kind of model here, and there's a desire to look at other more creative ways to maintain, that kind of commitment. But that's something that's going on. Obviously, the state reform and privatization is a big area. We talked already about the 50 or 60 companies. If they were able to privatize or partially privatize many of these companies, that could create substantial revenues on behalf of the country that could be used for enhancing their reserves and other things.
He's got a lot to do in 2 years, hasn't he?
Yeah.
So I guess the question I need to ask you, because you nailed it whenever it was 2 years ago now, is he going to win a second term? And I guess what are the risks and opportunities in that?
Like I said, I think if he continues executing on the plan, and he gets wins here and there, like, so for example, he brought down inflation. Give the guy credit. He eliminated a lot of wasteful government spending. Give the guy credit. Were there a couple of hiccups? Sure. But that's part of every political career. And I think that if he can continue to take the momentum that he was given in the midterms and start with a strong legislative agenda on December 10th, he has 2 years of more experience now of being in the role. So hopefully they can, execute things more cleanly. And he's got more of a majority than he's ever had. So now they can take on some of these additional things. My hope is that if he's able to continue the positive momentum, that the Argentinian people will continue to give him the mandate for change. There's no certainties in Argentinian politics, but, I think if he can stay scandal-free and continue to operate, as you say, as kind of this honest economist, I think people will continue to give him a mandate. And I think the other thing that is working to his advantage is the opposing party right now is incredibly weak. You've got Kirchner, who is a Trumpian type of politician, meaning she's got devout loyalists that are blind to pretty much anything other than what she says. And, she is so far refusing to get out of the way, even though she can never run for office again. And she's currently serving 6 or 7 years of house arrest and is likely to be serving more. She still has this ego where she can't get out of the way to allow the next generation of politician to come into play. Even the former president, Alberto Fernandez, many people thought that he was handpicked by Christina Kirchner and he was nothing more than a puppet to what she did or what she wanted, which he refuted. But then this guy, Axel Kicillof, who's basically the president of the Buenos Aires province, he's not been given the pat on the back yet from Christina and has been assigned blame for the loss their party took in the midterms. And you got Fernandez, who's got all kinds of scandals of his own that he's dealing with. So far, they haven't come up with anybody that I would think is a viable response to Milei. And even the former president, Mauricio Macri, as much as he tries to fight for relevance in his former party, PRO, there just doesn't seem to be an audience for it.
You mentioned something there. I think it's an irresistible irony around the whole thing is that Milei's big buddy, Donald, if he was an Argentinian, would almost certainly be a Peronist, wouldn't he?
Yes.
I mean, he loves tariffs. He has to be the big guy. Whereas Milei all he's been doing is trying to cut away the tariffs he inherited. Donald's still fighting for more tariffs. It's just...
I think they're very similar There
are similarities in that they're both outsiders, right? They pride themselves in not being politicians.
Yeah.
My personal view is that Javier Milei has more credibility with that claim than Donald, but...
Yeah, I agree. Trump is more like Kirchner.
Yeah, I mean, he is a populist, whereas Milei, not really a populist. I mean, Milei, as you said, he's brutally honest. And I think, this is what I want to ask you about really, I guess, in closing is, let's assume that Milei is successful in this next 2 years and he does get a second term and he does make Argentina the free market, the most capitalist country in the world, which I think he would do given that runway. And as you say, it's by no means certain that he can do that. But for me, I think that's so important for the world, particularly us stuck in Europe here. We're falling into the Peronist traps blindly. So I think it's so important he succeeds. And it comes down to the honesty of the man. Said, this is going to hurt you, but it's in your best interest. And which other politician can you point to in the world right now who's prepared to say and do those things?
Yeah, I agree. Trump does a good job of talking about, all the great things he's done, ending 8 wars, and people are like, how many? I thought I was only aware of 2, but yeah, okay. And talking about prices coming down in all these different areas, and everybody realizes that they're not. And I think other politicians like him they're falling into the trap of losing credibility. And you're going to see that in the U.S. midterm elections next year. And you already saw it in the elections that occurred a month ago. The Republicans are going to take a shellacking. I think Milei, as a person, people trust him. I think he's got a trustworthiness and just like a kind of a goofy, little brother kind of guy.
I got the feeling that I think Argentinians, some of the people I spoke to sort of, the Uber drivers, for example, they kind of relish the fact that he's a bit crazy, right?
Yeah, yeah.
That kind of goes with the Argentinian psyche. They like the fact that he's a bit loco, but also this outsider and someone that has got the opportunity to build trust. That's why I'm asking you about the sort of allegations around corruption. And if there was evidence that Milei just became another member of the cast, right, it would be tragic.
Yeah, and I think he obviously realizes that. His entire political fortunes are tied to that and staying, above board. And that's what I mean. I think as we get into the second half of his first term, and he's made some adjustments to his team, I think he needs to improve the professionalism of his, leadership team across the board. Presumably they're learning and they're getting better as well. And I think if he is able to get a second term, then I think it becomes about continuing with the reform agenda, but, also positioning his successors.
Thank you so much. I'm going to draw it to a close there, and I'm going to follow events with great interest, and hopefully we can have a follow-up chat sometime and an update on how you think he's getting on and what the prospects for Argentina are looking like in a few months, maybe a year's time or so.
Would love to, Jeremy. And thanks so much for reaching out. And I always follow your newsletters, and thank you for all the work you do.
Brought to you by Progressive Equity.